Hey everyone, Snazzy Chapeau here. I'll be hosting today's episode of Genre Bender's Obscurities and Flawed Gems because, well, frankly, because the Omni viewer is being kinda lazy. Pretty much everybody in the entire world knows the story of Frankenstein, even if only the most basic version of it. Mary Shelley's classic story has not only given us a name synonymous with mad science, but also provided us with the ultimate cautionary tale about man knowing his limits. The themes and imagery are eternal and universal, so it comes as little surprise that Frankenstein should wind up being adapted in so many different forms, especially when it comes to film. Heck, when Thomas Edison invented the movie camera, one of the first things he did with it was make a movie out of Frankenstein, of which very little footage survives today, unfortunately. So adapting Frankenstein to film is a tradition literally as old as film itself. It even served as the inspiration for such works as Jurassic Park, The Incredible Hulk, and the latest version of Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla. However, this popularity does come with a price. The story of a scientist creating life has ironically been done to death, and adapting Frankenstein has become a practice in experimenting with visuals rather than trying to take the story in new directions. This brings us to today's film, Hammer's 1957 adaptation, The Curse of Frankenstein, which stands apart as very singular in its approach. Allow me to explain why. The year is 1860, and Baron Victor Frankenstein is in jail, awaiting his execution by beheading for several counts of murder. A priest has been summoned to receive the Baron's confession and give him his last rites, but Victor has no interest in either. He protests innocence, even though he knows his alibi is unbelievable, and has summoned someone that he claims can back him up. Victor cannot deny that several people connected to him have died, but he insists that he didn't kill them. He was trying to overcome death by creating life, and the resulting monster is the one who committed all those murders. Well, that's what the doctor says at any rate. This was Hammer Studios' first venture into the horror genre, and the stakes could not have been higher. Universal Studios had already made a successful franchise out of Frankenstein throughout the 30s and 40s, and their version had become so iconic that it had been ingrained into the public consciousness of the entire world. Odds are, when you think about Frankenstein, you think about Boris Karloff's green-skinned, box-headed monster being brought to life by Tesla-inspired gadgetry, none of which came from the book, mind you. Hammer's problem, therefore, was trying to figure out how to make their version of Frankenstein unique, and not something that would draw constant comparison to the Universal films. The solution they chose was nothing short of brilliant. Introduce ambiguity. Like I said, everybody knows the story of Frankenstein in some way, but we also know it as a literal story. No doubt exists that Victor really did experiment with creating life, and that the result of his experiments was a monster that wound up terrorizing the populace. Even the original book drops the notion that Victor is delusional when the monster appears at the end to pretty much confirm everything he said. However, before that point, the person that Victor tells his story to, a sailor on an Arctic expedition, wonders briefly if the story could possibly be false. The Curse of Frankenstein takes that idea and runs with it. We still hear Victor insist that he created life, albeit imperfect life, but he has no evidence to support his claim. Now, this sort of thing is harder to do on film than you would think, since the audience automatically assumes that what they're being shown on screen is literal. Unless a perspective exists to show us a different sequence of events, we usually have to accept that what we're being shown is the truth. So how does The Curse of Frankenstein circumvent this problem and cast doubt on Victor's claims to making monsters? Well, it happens by way of presenting the good doctor as a selfish jerk. Victor is written as very single-minded in his goals and very much concerned with his own success, self-image, and well-being. In this version of the story, Victor is engaged to a lovely young woman who is not his adopted sister. Thank God, because that part of the book always skeeved me out. However, he is cheating on her with his housekeeper. About halfway through the film, the housekeeper tells Victor that she is pregnant with his child, and he responds in a calm, rational, level-headed... I'm just kidding, he calls her a strumpet and kicks her out on the street.
Why choose me as the father? Pick any man in the village. The chances are to be the right one.
Coincidentally, the housekeeper winds up becoming the monster's first victim, and it's here that the ambiguity comes into play. Victor does have a motive to kill her, since a child born out of wedlock by his mistress would ruin his reputation, and we know that he's not very gentlemanly towards her. Blaming her death on the monster almost sounds like an excuse, even if the monster was real. His partner also expresses great disgust with Victor, but is it because he's experimenting with things he shouldn't, or because he's a madman who's killing people? Well, That's part of the ambiguity. We're never quite sure of what the truth really is, and a large part of that is thanks to Peter Cushing's portrayal as the Doctor. There are moments where he can make us absolutely loathe Frankenstein, and yet there are also moments where he can make us feel oddly sympathetic towards him, especially since it's pretty clear that he does believe there was a monster, even if nobody else around him does. He is the most iconic part of the movie. Boris Karloff may be the definitive monster, but Peter Cushing is without a doubt the definitive Victor Frankenstein. Speaking of the monster, he's played by Christopher Lee in this film. I really don't have that much to say about the performance, since the nature of the story requires that the monster have less screen time than usual. That being said, though, it's Christopher Lee. The man is amazing in everything he does, even if it's singing heavy metal concept albums. What the monster lacks in screen time, he more than makes up for it with sheer menace. And that makeup job. Look at that face. I mean, look at it. That has got to be the most gruesome version of the monster that I have ever seen. Ultimately, this alternate take on a classic story, one which thus far has never been duplicated, worked incredibly well, and wound up setting the tone not just for its sequels, but for all of Hammer's future horror films. Alternate takes on classic horror would become their bread and butter, from a story where Van Helsing fights Chinese vampires, to a story where Dr. Jekyll turns himself into an evil, sadistic, murderous woman. The Frankenstein sequels would also continue this trend, but the expense would be the undoing of the first film's ambiguity. The immediate sequel, The Revenge of Frankenstein, makes it very clear that Victor was telling the truth, and that would remain the case for the rest of the franchise. I understand that was necessary to keep the series going, and Revenge is still a good film in its own right, but I almost wonder if that was the wrong decision. I kind of feel like Curse of Frankenstein should have stood on its own, and the rest of the movies should have been set in their own continuity. But oh well. Regardless of anything else, The Curse of Frankenstein does the impossible by presenting a story everybody knows in a way that nobody else has done. It remains singular in its interpretation, and you need to see it for yourself. Well, that's all for now. This is Snazzy Chapeau saying, see you later. Hey! What was that crack you made about me being lazy?
This is my video! Get out!
I swear, some people are just so rude.
Better not touch our friend here while I'm gone. Let him rest in peace while he can. Let's have some food. I'm hungry.